This is the Truth Be Told podcast, where we unlock the secrets of strategic communication. Welcome to this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast. If you could, please take a minute to hit like, subscribe, and leave us a review so that we can keep great content coming your way. On today's episode, I am joined by a well-known leader in the loss prevention and retail industry, David Lund. David has nearly 35 years in the retail sector and has held executive roles in organizations like Dick's Sporting Goods, Polo, and Macy's. Starting as a store detective, he navigated through a diverse field in corporate positions, steering corporate security, executive protection, investigations, and strategic asset protection initiatives, both nationally and internationally. David has also served as chairman of the Retail Industry Leaders Association Asset Protection Steering Committee and the Asset Protection Leaders Council. He also lent his expertise to the National Retail Federation, LP Council, the Loss Prevention Research Council, and Loss Prevention Magazine. David has got a passion for continuing education. His credentials include a bachelor's in industrial and commercial security from York College of Pennsylvania and an MBA from the University of Pittsburgh. David is a certified forensic interviewer and also holds the loss prevention certified designation. Most recently, and most excitedly for me, David has joined the International Association of Interviewers as their executive director and also serves as an instructor for Wicklander-Zalowski. On this episode, we're going to discuss how effective communication has impacted David's career. We'll also put him on the leadership hot seat with our top 5 question segment. And we're going to learn about the future of II and the CFI designation. Let's get right to the conversation. Welcome to this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast. I am here with David Lund, CFI, Executive Director for II, instructor at WZ, industry veteran, and he came formally dressed today for those of you that are unable to watch the podcast, but I like what you chose with your outfit there.
Well, I do see each episode that T-shirt is the attire of choice for you. So I wanted to wear a T-shirt as well, but at the same time, I wanted to dress up because this is important.
I like that. I think that's the Canadian tuxedo is what it's called. No offense to our Canadian listeners. I grew up 15 minutes from Canada, so I think I'm partly Canadian and have the right to say it. But I like it. I got my Guam shirt on. We taught a class for Department of Defense and the Inspector Generals in Guam a couple months ago. It's a cool experience. So anyway, so we got a good balance here. I know the group just heard a little bit about your background, but before we dive into all things that you've done and how interviewing kind of played a role in your life experience, maybe just give a little background on how you got to where you're sitting today.
Right on. I'd love to. So I've been really blessed to have a varied career. I've had the opportunity to work in a lot of different retail environments, discount stores, luxury retail. I've had offices in rural environments and urban settings. I've had international exposure, primarily in Europe and Asia. I've been a pure play security person. Dabbled in executive protection, multi-unit asset protection, and investigations, of course, which has really been my passion, both as a leader and as an investigator. But I've really spent, I guess, maybe my most recent years largely in administrative roles, which are important also in their own way. But nothing gets my motor running like teaching and training and investigations. And to be able to marry those things, those passions, has really been a dream of mine. It did start with my first experience in the interview setting, if you will, as a witness. And I thought, wow, how does this even happen? How do these conversations get where they are? And it really whet my appetite for retail and for retail loss prevention. We called it security in the 90s. But anyway, I think Wayne Hoover recently described investigative interviewing as mental chess. And I tend to agree with that. And it's really what kept me interested in the craft. I really did want to become an investigator, so I took jobs that led me to that, which in turn led to investigative leadership roles and then other leadership roles. And that's how I got here today. Investigations launched me and really kept my interest, and it's really still where my passion is.
Do you remember what that first interview? I don't know if you remember the specifics of sitting in the room, but any idea what that felt like at the time, sitting as a witness, not having any clue what's about to happen here?
I don't know who was more nervous in the room. The interviewer, who was clearly nervous to me, and maybe because he was performing, if you will. The subject of the interview, who had done something wrong, or me, because I just didn't know what to expect. So like the nervous energy in the room was just absolutely overflowing. I do remember very specifically was merchandise theft case. It was in a kind of a tailored clothing environment, so kind of better menswear, and the price points were pretty high because of that. But I just the rest of it, I just kind of remember the beginning and the end, and at the end, I was just astonished that this person would admit to stealing all this stuff. I just couldn't believe it.
Yeah. And I think I'm not going to, of course, date. I'm sure it was just a few years ago that that was, but I bet you it was more like checkers then, and it's more like chess now. And I think that's a lot what we'll talk about on the call is I know your passion for continued education, but really where interviewing is going and has gone the last decade or so is the focus on evidence-based practices and bringing more research and structure and science into the interview room versus what it may have been a few years ago.
In that case, it certainly was checkers comparatively. And while the interviewer was using the WZ method at the time, it was really, I would call, unskilled and unpracticed. It was, once I got into it more myself, I realized in retrospect, how poor a job he really did. But the admission came nonetheless.
Yeah, and that's something we'll talk about too. I know you, and as a leader, have focused a lot on making sure the ends don't justify the means, right? And going back and kind of looking at an interview process and what that looked like. But I want to, before I get into that, back to your kind of career path. I know interviewing and investigation has always been a passion of yours. How much do you feel like that's impacted your career, either success or interactions with people that, but well outside of an interview or an investigation? Have those skills translated into different aspects of your role?
Yeah, I think what we do translates, and we often talk about this in the seminar, is how these skills translate into real life relationships and in our personal lives as well. And it's not a manipulative kind of way. It's just more about social skills and interacting with people and understanding empathy. So yeah, I would say that it all translates into just every aspect of your life, not just career, but on the personal side as well.
Yeah, and I know one of the things that's always been it's uncomfortable, like you mentioned, is even as a witness in the room, but it can be uncomfortable to sit in an interview where whether it's a theft case or it's a serious criminal case, the person you're talking to, it's probably life changing conversation. They may lose their job, they may be have criminal charges pressed against them. But I've felt like in a non-confrontational interview, we maintain a positive relationship as best you can still with that person. And I want to tie that back to what I've seen. You recently left a position, a very significant leadership role that you were in, built relationships across the last couple of decades, and now all you see is all this positive remarks about you and your career and where you're going next. And I'm wondering how much that same concept of, vendors you've interacted with, employees that maybe don't work for you anymore, maybe they lost their job, maybe they were working well for you, but throughout all these difficult encounters and difficult conversations, you've managed to maintain positive relationships. So I don't know if you can see a connection there or kind of what's the key behind that you've seen in your career?
It is. It's not a secret. It's not necessarily science, and it's something that's foundational to everything that we do, and especially in an interview setting, is treating everybody with dignity and respect. When you treat people well, it's the golden rule. Like treat people the way you want to be treated. And I think it is really that simple. It is really that simple, and I think that's been. I wouldn't even call it a secret to success. I mean, when you build relationships with people, if you treat them respectfully, regardless of whether they're interacting with you in your own business, in a supporting business as a solution provider, or if they've made a bad choice, when you treat people that way, you get it back, and it ends up in lifelong relationships a lot of times.
Yeah, and it can be difficult, and I'm sure in the various leadership roles you've had, and we're not going to list every company, but it's possible some of the companies aren't in business anymore, or doing so well, or are doing great. But we know in the retail world, just based off of the evolution of business is there's going to be a reduction in force. There's going to be headcount changes, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. But I would imagine all of those types of conversations that you might have to have, you would reflect back on conducting investigative interviews and I guess, how do I, with empathy, talk to somebody who I have to deliver bad news to?
Yeah, and I'll tell you, we all have stories if we've done it the right way, and maybe more stories than others, where you actually get thanked at the end when somebody's actually even waiting. They know the police are coming, and they know that there's a huge change that's about to happen in their lives, and they're actually thanking you for getting them to that point, and helping them make the decision to be honest. And even though they know it's going to hurt, they know it was for good. And like that is the most incredible thing is to be in that place with a person and have empathized with them and understand, and then they thank you for it. It's
Yeah.
it's very unique.
Yeah, and I know another part that I know has made you successful in your career is the collaboration with other verticals. And whether people are listening are in retail or not, you've worked, and you could probably list others, but very closely with human resources, employee relations groups, and legal team, and compliance, operations, and marketing, and then outside of the four walls of a store, law enforcement and prosecutors and associations and other retailers. And so there's a lot of partnerships to create. But how impactful has that been, or what are maybe some of the keys to those relationships, especially within an organization when you all have different maybe perspectives on what's priority?
So that's an awesome question. Well, you mentioned human resources and legal, and those can be maybe some of the most challenging relationships that we have as loss prevention or asset protection professionals in retail. So they can be challenging, but they're certainly, I would say, the most important also. I've always approached things with those groups specifically, starting with the things we can agree on, because there are going to be disagreements invariably. But if we can all agree, and we do, that we're going to treat everybody with dignity and respect, we want to keep the company out of trouble, and we don't want to employ bad people who are going to infect our otherwise good culture. Like we all get that, we all agree at that. If we use those principles as a foundation for all of our discussions, we won't always agree, but we won't approach it as contentiously or adversarial in nature, especially when it comes to investigations, because that's where the most of the conflict comes up. Is maybe an investigator expects there to be a termination, but there might be a reason that there wouldn't be, or the human resources or legal person has this expectation that the investigator is not going to treat somebody fairly. So if we get all that on the table and everybody agrees to those things, the rest of the conversations become pretty easy.
Yeah, I'm gonna throw a curveball and talk about sometimes that people disagree.
Sure.
Because I think one of the things as interviewers that I know you've grown a passion to is there's going to be resistance in a conversation where people maybe don't want to give you information, maybe because they don't have it, or maybe they have it and they have reasons not to provide it. But I feel like those same things happen in a leadership role. Is people are going to challenge you and ask you questions, and you have to find a way not to respond overly witty, maybe. I think there's probably that first response that you want to say to somebody that maybe you go home and tell your family or friends that you did say, but in reality, you've got a kind of a different way to communicate it. So I put together a quick little list of put David Lund in the leadership hot seat here. And we should say we're not giving any legal advice in case he says something that you go run and tell somebody to. But just a couple quick questions. I got five of them from different partners that you might work with, and see, you maybe don't have the perfect response, but kind of the thought process in responding. And so I categorized by some different groups. I'm going to start with the sales and marketing teams, and this could be called different things at different organizations that are out there. But I would imagine there's times where you've got some product in a store and customers can make the same complaint, but product in a store that is locked up behind a glass cage, behind a case, razor blades at a convenience store that I got to wait 20 minutes for a customer service rep to help me. So when sales and marketing calls up a loss prevention leader and says, why in the hell do we have to lock this stuff up? We're preventing sales. How do we respond to that?
Oh my gosh! So it makes me sweat a little bit. I've been called sales prevention more often than I'd like to admit. And look, the truth of the matter is nobody loves to shop in an environment like that. It's not fun waiting for something to be unlocked so that you can take it to the point of sale as an honest person and pay for it. But I would argue that is nothing more frustrating than driving somewhere to buy something that you expect is there. And a lot of times, inventory is available to see online. You can see that a retailer's in stock in something that you want, and you don't need to buy it online. You'll just go get it. And so, nothing's more frustrating than going there only to find it's not really there. And the store doesn't know it's not there either, because their systems, they'll look it up and says, yeah, I'm supposed to have 4 of these, and then they run around the store looking for it and they can't find it. And so what ends up happening is you leave to go somewhere else to find it, or you have to buy it online anyways, and you just wasted your time. So for me as a consumer, and it's easy for me to say because I'm a practitioner also, I'd rather see that it's there and have to wait for it and then be done with it than think that it's there, not find it, and have to start all over again. So that's what I tell my marketing and sales friends when they call me sales prevention. It's like, look, I don't get bonused on what we don't lose. I get bonused on what we sell, and you can't sell it if you don't have it.
Yeah, it's a great response, and because you're not placing blame there, right? You're creating another opportunity for the customer to be successful in that exchange. Because otherwise, I've been there, right? I've looked, and you got 3 on hand, and then I'm the idiot arguing with the poor customer service rep saying, "Well, your inventory says 3," and but then you know what happens next? I got to go drive down the road and go to a competitor and buy it from somewhere else, plus whatever
Yeah.
else I'm going to get, and it changes my habits. All right, good. Go to number 2. I got 5 of these, so far so good. Um, let's say we get a phone call from maybe a local prosecutor, law enforcement, and we got a lot of investigators on that side of the fence to listen to these. And they call up you or a leader and a regional leader and say, "Why do you want me to waste time on these shoplifting cases? I got bigger fish to fry out there than prosecuting all these cases. What do you want me to do?"
Wow. So I don't think that most realize that shoplifting, this isn't your father's shoplifting anymore or your grandfather's shoplifting. A lot of this stuff gets violent really quickly. And the way I've looked at it in my past is, the more volume of activity you have, the more opportunity there is for people to get hurt. And nobody wants that. Law enforcement certainly doesn't want that. They're the quickest to respond if there's a call for somebody who's in trouble and needs help. And while shoplifting doesn't seem like it could contribute to that, it certainly does. And I think it's incumbent on all of us in this industry to help law enforcement and governments at every level understand what a crisis this is, because we are in a place where this seemingly nonviolent, victimless crime, they're big companies that can afford it kind of thing, really are getting people like severely injured and killed on a pretty regular basis. I mean, it's uncanny, but we do need to let our governments know and our law enforcement partners know just how dangerous the shoplifting problem is, and if we just let it go because we don't think it's important, people will be affected.
Yeah, that's great. Education there is so important. I mean, we could spend a long time talking about organized retail crime and the bigger impact on inventory and cost in the business. But I know the most important thing, and you've shared this with me a bunch of times, is the fear of, are my employees safe and are my customers safe when they come in and out of your property, and so whatever we can do to prevent that, important. All right, number 3 of our top 5, hot 5, quick 5, whatever. We'll come up with a tricky name for the segment. Let's say we get a phone call from HR, maybe legal, depending kind of in what organization who's overseeing some of these interviews specifically. And this might be out of curiosity or out of challenge, but after an interview, they say, "Well, how did you get them to give you all that information? Something you must have done something you're not supposed to do in that room. What is your team doing out there to get people to tell you the truth or the alleged truth?"
Gosh, it's difficult for somebody who doesn't know what we do and how we do it and the evidence-based practices behind it. It's just tough to say, well, I just asked. Like I built a relationship in a very small amount of time, and I just asked, and they told me. And for those that don't know, they're like, it's impossible. Like that's nobody, why would anybody ever do that? So that's why I've made it a practice wherever I've worked and had the opportunity to provide training to my human resources and legal partners. They get the same training that my team gets. And when they do, they never ask the question again because they just get it. They know it's no trickery, there's no shenanigans, there's none of that. It's just about relationship building and asking the question.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. It seems so simple, and of course, there's a lot that goes into the structure behind it and the investigation before that conversation, of
Oh yeah,
course. But it's that simple approach. I think if we just gave somebody, maybe somebody's listening now that's never conducted an investigation before or an interview, and they work somewhere, or they have kids or a significant other, but if you walk in the room and the first thing you say is, why did you break the window, or why did you use money for that, or why did you steal? Everybody's first response is, what the hell are you talking about? No, I didn't do it. And so, that foundation, as you mentioned, of being like rapport and empathy and treating everybody the right way, just it goes so far, even in these unconventional conversations. So I think that's great. And the fact that you want other members of your team to know what's going on, transparency is huge. And we'll talk a little bit about that too, because I know you're a big fan of recording interviews in your experience. All right, question number 4. Um, let's say this is coming from your finance department, so the CFO, maybe in your experience, or maybe somebody's getting this from a regional ops manager or something, and you're asking either for more staffing or more cameras or more something to help your team, but they come back at you and they say, I want to remind you that you're a cost center, loss prevention or asset protection. You guys just cost us money all the time. Maybe if you start bringing us revenue in, then we'll look at investing more into your division. First of all, before you answer that, is that a question or a comment you may have ever gotten in your experience?
100%.
All right. How do we respond to that? Now you could probably give a whole diatribe, but what would be the way to respond to something like that?
So it's great, and it's a tough question because you can't always put dollars on what we do, and there isn't an equation for how much we saved that we didn't know we would have otherwise lost. So there's a shrink number, and is it going up or is it going down? And if it's going up, is the work that you're doing keeping it from going up faster? And if it's going down, is it really your work that's causing it to go down? So you never know. So I think what practitioners have done over the last couple of decades have worked to build programs that show positive ROI that might not be necessarily shrink related. But around I think things around the concept of total retail loss. So how are we saving the company money, whether it's expenses or point of sale discounts or spoilage or whatever it might be? How are we working to affect the company positively that might also offset shrink? Because suddenly you're not a cost center anymore. Suddenly you're actually making money.
Right.
We as a loss prevention team in my last job brought in a tool that would help us to actually generate revenue at the point of sale using our returns database. And there suddenly we're paying not only for our program, but we're generating revenue for the company. That doesn't stop those other questions from coming, by the way, Dave. They still come, but you can justify activity very proactively in other ways. So yeah, that's the best answer because there's really no real magic math that we
Yeah.
can do.
Yeah, I like that though, and I think we'll talk about this in a few minutes. But I think redefining the traditional loss prevention role as a true business professional, somebody who's looking at a profit and loss statement, and who's looking at how can I bring revenue back to the business at the same time through protecting the assets of the organization, including the people. I think the business acumen has been a huge, I want to say change, probably the last 10 to 15 years in that industry or that
That's really
vertical.
important.
Last question, then I'm going to go back to kind of some of the things we just mentioned. You might get this from a store manager, store associate, media, a friend at dinner that says, I keep seeing on the news or in my stores, these people they're stealing stuff and they're walking right out the front door, and people are just waving on the way out and they're not doing anything about it. Isn't that your job? Why are we not making an apprehension? Why are we not approaching these people?
So I mentioned it earlier, and it's safety. You just never know what's going to happen. And I like to talk about, what's next and that we don't get to decide for other people. There's a lot of passion out there where we'll see store associates or loss prevention team members who are not supposed to make apprehensions go try to do that. And once they start that from that initial interaction, they don't control what happens after that. If a weapon is produced, a knife, a gun, pepper spray, you don't get to control that, and it affects other people in the environment and who didn't choose to interact with that person. So that's always what I talk about is like once you start that interaction, it goes where it goes, and you don't control it anymore. You control whether it starts by not getting engaged. That part is really important. The other component of this is related to what people maybe don't see that we do after the fact. So while the bad guy may seemingly get away, we've got tools and technology that will help us to identify those people, whether it's cameras in the parking lot, license plate reading technology, or other technologies inside the store, not to mention eyewitness accounts, that help us to identify who those bad actors are and go after them after the fact. And many companies, including companies I've worked for, have been really successful doing this. Unfortunately, most people don't know that happens. They don't know that technology that might be some cameras in the parking lot or overseeing a part of the store are used to identify perpetrators and then go identify who they are, where they live, what they've stolen, and even connect cases to other stores and other retailers to affect successful prosecutions. But a lot of that happens behind the scenes after the fact.
Yeah, I think that's huge. A lot of people don't know, like you said. And as you were talking about the safety piece, I know we could probably sit here and talk about war stories forever and probably some negative encounters. But I remember just 10, 15 years ago when I was in that field and I'm in Buffalo, New York, and having people on my team, and I get that phone call where they were working on a blitz together. So you got a group of retailers and law enforcement kind of looking at some high risk markets and putting a lot of staffing into those markets in a couple of days. And they had a shoplifter, maybe a couple $100s worth of product, and they go to make that approach. And what you just said is a really good point. As soon as that approach is made, especially when you don't have law enforcement with you have a lack of control, right? There's no use of force. There's no restraints anymore. None of that exists. One of the loss prevention professionals got stabbed in the hip. One got stabbed in the neck, and they both survived through it, but not a situation you want to be in, especially not to protect merchandise. And
No.
fast forward to now, what you just mentioned is, I think it's incredible what some of those solution providers have out there, from license plate readers to make facial recognition if it's accurate and consistent, information sharing, building a case where maybe we get to a point where you never have to approach somebody in a parking lot anymore, right? Maybe that goes away. I think that's great.
It's pretty awesome. And the thing is, it's incumbent on us as practitioners to share this with the people that we work with so they understand it is that we're not doing nothing. There are things happening, and they're happening after the fact solely to keep them all safe.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? Even that store associate or the customer who comes in and they see this stuff, it's you don't want it. You're not going to give them, well, here, by the way, is our full standard operating procedure and how we investigate. But giving people that confidence and faith that we are here, we are doing something, we are responding. I know it's something we talk about a lot in our training classes. Is when you have, whether it's sexual harassment, discrimination, theft, but maybe you don't have enough information that shows you exactly who's responsible. And so sometimes investigators are nervous or apprehensive to actually go talk to people because there's not enough evidence. And teaching this middle ground of how do I just do a fact gathering conversation, and kind of the analogy is if you've got somebody who maybe they're sitting at home, they're retired midday, and they see some sports car flying by their house at 80 miles an hour on a 30-mile-an-hour road, and every single day. So they call the police and say, somebody do something about this. Even if that person doesn't go get arrested or get a ticket, I think if that citizen sees a police officer running radar or driving down the road once in a while, they have faith in the agency. And that's the same thing I think you're talking about, is let's just educate people that we're there, we're present, and we're doing something to support you.
And not for nothing, I think if the bad people knew that kind of thing was possible, and they didn't really just get away with it, they'd probably do less of it.
That's true. A little higher risk of detection, a little fear of detection in there. Yeah.
Yep.
I want to go back because you mentioned, or I heard a couple things that you said and wanted to add on to it. From your perspective, recording was one. You talked about, from an interview standpoint, having maybe HR or legal sit in on a training class or sit in on the actual interview to learn what was going on. And I know you've been a proponent of electronic recording of an interview. How, and I know I'm sure that wasn't well received when you first maybe pitched that, but what's kind of been the evolution of that in your experience?
So I had the opportunity, thankfully, to work for a company that video recorded their statement taking process. So the interviews themselves weren't recorded, but the statement taking process was video recorded. And I learned to collect much better statements by watching myself in those videos. And although that wasn't ever the reason for the recording, that was more of a legal requirement for the company. I used it for good for me to learn more about my own presence in the room and the way I was structuring that part of the conversation. And when I got promoted into positions where I could actually bring interview recording into the companies that I work for, it was always about upskilling the investigator. It was always about watching, how we performed, what we said, how the subject reacted, all of that. And that's all based, because of my own experience there. It certainly is not comfortable to do for those that aren't used to it. It doesn't take that long to get used to. Once you've done it and you've seen yourself a couple of times and you've cringed enough, you're like, okay, let me start learning. And people actually tend to like it. But what I've also learned over time is the investigators who are recorded tend to do a better job following whatever prescribed practices that are a company is using. They don't tend to get into trouble. There's very few complaints, if any. And when they are raised, we can review them more completely when there's a recording. And if there's, retraining to do, we can do it, or we can share with the person, yeah, that's not exactly how it went. If everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing when they're recorded, I have never found a downfall for it. Like really, other than embarrassing yourself. Yeah, that's it.
We've done plenty of the embarrassing at WZ because we record all of our, and credit to Dave Zalowski and Doug Wicklander when they founded the company ahead of their time, but we're very pro recording over 40 years ago. And so every interview that we've done is being able to go back and kind of critique, and the training element is huge. There's some research out there that, people were concerned, well, if we record and we tell the subject they're being recorded, they're not going to give us any information. And so far that data has not supported that theory. People are still giving them, you've seen it, they're still giving information. What it actually found is it has a greater impact, not on the interviewee, but on the interviewer's behavior, because they know they're being recorded. So they're more compliant to whatever training and policies and procedures, which obviously is what we all want. So I think that's huge. But you're right, watching or listening to yourself can be terrible. I mean, it's the same thing when you're training a course and you're maybe watching yourself on a recording of a Zoom call or something. It's not the prettiest thing to have to look at all day.
I'm gonna watch this back and hate it, I
Yeah,
promise.
right. Yeah, I know. It's whenever we got to make an edit on one of these, and I got to listen to my voice or see the light bouncing off my forehead. I try to just listen to the audio version. It makes it a lot easier to make edits. But it's funny actually when you say that. I remember one of my first interviews with WZ, and went back and watched the video, and it was an embezzlement case, where we used kind of the participatory method and withheld evidence to get somebody to commit to a story, then go through the WZ method. But until I watched afterwards, I didn't realize, I'm wearing a shirt that says certified forensic interviewer on it or something like that, which is, probably not the best thing to create rapport in the room. And then I'm thinking, I coughed. I was sick that day. So like every time I coughed, that annoyed me. And when I was being lied to, my voice kind of, it didn't raise like angrily, but I became, sharper. And then my hands get dramatic. And I mentioned this on one of our other calls. But I didn't know that until I watched myself. I'm like, what in the hell message are you conveying to the person in the room? So I think that's really powerful.
It's great awareness for yourself. I always ask those that whether they're in human resources or legal or somewhere else in the business when they don't want to record. I mean, I just have to assume they think we're going to do something wrong that they don't want to be preserved. It's
Right.
like let's approach it like we're going to do something right. We're going to be professionals in the room, and that's why we want it recorded,
Yeah.
not because we're going to do something wrong and we need to be scared about it.
Yeah, which, as you know, is obviously the wrong approach. And but I think it's just the same concept of like, would you rather record it, see it's wrong, and fix it, or put your head in the sand, and the interviewee records it without us knowing, and we're going to find out anyway, or people are being wrongfully terminated or discriminated or whatever, and we find out anyway. So yeah, I think you're right. That's some of the resistance that's out there. And I think cost used to be an area of resistance, but now technology, you don't need these huge servers at every location anymore to store recordings of video or audio. So it's a lot easier and more efficient now, I
For
would
sure.
say. Yeah. Part of your role, especially at what you're doing now, and the reason part of what you're doing now is because you're just passionate about it. I know you told me a while ago it's kind of been on your wish list of something to be able to teach and mentor, and you love the interview investigation piece. But you said something to me the other day that kind of stuck with me is that good trainers or instructors also have to be great students. And so maybe explain how you prioritize that throughout your career of continued education, regardless of what it is in, but always kind of proving to further educate yourself.
So yeah, I'm just a curious person. I do love to learn. I love to learn trivial things. I like to learn things that are meaningful. I do it a lot of different ways. I mean, I do love to read. I read very, very slowly, but I'll read books about the craft, whatever craft that is. It might be, building something or something like investigative interviewing, journal articles, industry publications for professional development. I listen to podcasts, including Truth Be Told. I watch YouTube videos. And of course, I've pursued certifications and postgraduate education. I just like to learn. So yeah, I think that's really what it comes down to.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of people, regardless of the field, but a lot of listeners, obviously in the loss prevention or HR space, where you mentioned this before, the job is no longer what the job always was, and so I've got some colleagues in that space that went from experts in investigations and shoplifting catching to managing the negotiations with insurance companies on premiums to understanding general liability and workers' comp claims to business operations or working with vendors. And so I think it's for those people that are listening that are looking at how if I want to stay in that industry and kind of progress in my career, there's a lot of different ways that you can educate yourself and learn. But what my question to you is I might not necessarily go find a class on how do I learn how to what kind of insurance plan is best for a corporate organization. How do I show my boss that that's something I know about? And these kind of weird little verticals. So, what are some different ways that maybe people can work to educate themselves while they're still on the job?
So networking inside your organization is a great place to start. If you've got an interest in risk management, but it's not part of your bailiwick today, go find your risk manager and talk to them about what they do and how they do it. People love to talk about what they do. I know I certainly do. And you'll learn a little. You can ask deeper questions, and that'll lead you to other places. What industry magazines do you have? Are there places I can go to learn more about this? Taking classes at a community college. Pretty easy to do, pretty inexpensive, and a great way to gain quick knowledge. But yeah, you might if you have a question about accounting or reading the P&L. You talked about that earlier. Going to somebody in your FP&A group who can help you learn how to read the P&L the way they read it will make you a lot smarter about the business, number one, but you also speak more intelligently to senior leaders who was like, wow, this person really knows what they're talking about.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's really good advice. We when I say we, just as people, tend to surround ourselves with people who congratulate us and support us and say you're great and everything's wonderful. But I think there's a good challenge out there to get out of the echo chamber and try to find people with a different perspective, different background, diverse, and that will give you some of that honest feedback. And so one of our other guests that we had on, Anna Papalia, who's going to be one of the speakers at Elite Training Day this year in October, she's a professional in the HR space and job interviews and kind of really outside my experience. But even a really simple task she gave people that were listening, and it goes back to your recording piece, is some of those common questions you get asked in the job interview, like, what are your greatest strengths and weaknesses? Why do you want to work here? Tell me about yourself. And her challenge was, record yourself, put your phone on selfie mode and record yourself answering those questions, and then listen to yourself and how you answered. But I think even in addition to that is have somebody who's going to be judgy listen to your answers and give you some direct feedback. So I think it combines a lot of that. It's like that transparency. It's being open to new ideas and new challenges.
Yeah, if you let your ego get in the way, and tell yourself like I don't want people to know that I don't know how to read the P&L, or I don't want people to know that I don't know about risk management. If you let that get in the way, you'll never learn effectively. Like you could read enough books, but unless you talk to people who are in that space and they're giving you real life perspective, you probably won't get it. At least get it quickly.
Yeah, and what ties into this whole, our podcast, this theme of communication is communicating when you don't know something is welcomed and embraced. And even as an instructor, you're out there, we're training, and somebody asks a question, you don't know the answer. That's okay. I think what's even worse is when people enter a conversation or an argument and they come in with full confidence of their response, but they're actually not fully educated or aware of it. And so I think coming in and saying, you know what, I'm like 80% sure of this, but I haven't looked at that paper in a while, or I remember hearing this, but I could be wrong. And that vulnerability creates better dialogue, and versus kind of that direct confidence in a conversation.
It comes across way more genuine. It's more authentic, and people do appreciate that. They appreciate like nobody knows everything, and it's
Right.
okay to not know. And it's more comfortable to be around people who don't know everything.
And from a strategic standpoint, you're probably going to get a lot closer to whatever your end goal of that conversation was if you're willing to talk through it. So I think that's really important. That's good. I know I mentioned a couple things about Elite Training Day and a couple speakers coming up, and we haven't spent time on this, but you're in this a new role, partly of training, investigative interviewing across the industry, and then also leading the International Association of Interviewers, which I'm super excited about, bringing your experience, not just from your leadership and business acumen experience, but kind of visionary and your passion for continued education. And so I know you're getting your kind of feet into everything right now, but we've got Elite Training Day coming up in October this year, in the Chicago area. Anything about that? I know you've attended those events before, but anything specifically about that you're most excited to be a part of?
So I don't know if I'm talking out of school, but this October at Elite Training Days, we'll be able to unveil the CFI 2.0, which is something I'm really excited about. And what I really love about this evidence-based content, and it's new enough for anyone who's actually already a CFI. If they go through it, they're actually going to feel 2.0. Like it's next level stuff. I can't wait to go through it myself, quite frankly. But that's maybe besides the awesome speakers that we have lined up. I should say you have lined up. I haven't done a lot for it yet, but the speakers that are lined up are going to be simply outstanding. But to be able to share with the community, CFI 2.0 it's probably what's most exciting to me right now.
Yeah, I can't wait. And it's been a collective effort. We've got a great team, as most people listening know of our group, but a great team that's helped put the conference together. And we've got a lot of great ambassadors out there from the association. And if you're unaware of the association, you can go to certifiedinterviewer.com to learn more about it. But we've got a lot of volunteers this year at Elite Training Day. They're going to kind of help organize some things. And but CFI 2.0, for those of you that don't know, we've got the Certified Forensic Interviewer designation that we're celebrating our 20th anniversary of that designation this year, which is really exciting. But we've really challenged the exam itself and the content to make sure it is meeting the current standards of research. And there's been so much, just growing body of research in the last 10 years or greater on not just investigative interviewing, but how to handle or manage, people with vulnerabilities in an interview, maybe youthful people or other vulnerabilities. How to understand how trauma impacts, people in an interview or in a conversation. updates on really the best way to use evidence during an interview, right? Not being deceptive and withholding key pieces. And so I'm really excited about it. It's going to be a challenge. It's a difficult exam for people to take, but at the end of the day, it's to really prove that you have demonstrated this kind of elite level of knowledge in the interviewing space. So I'm excited about that as well.
Cool.
The conference itself, I'll drop a couple hints here of our speakers, and I'm sure people can go find it on the agenda. But the other thing that's really cool for me at these events, I know you've been at a handful, a lot of these Elite Training Day events as a participant, and now I'll be on the other side of it. But I've always enjoyed that the content is very diverse. I don't know if you've got, before I kind of list some speakers this year, if you've got anything from past events that stick out to you or things that maybe you brought back to your organization to implement.
So the implementation component, I guess, probably too big to number, but I'll tell you, one of the most meaningful presentations that we saw, and this is a kind of the caliber of speaker that we get, was the interrogator Saddam Hussein. I don't think I'd ever seen such a dynamic presentation about such an interesting subject that I didn't know I knew nothing about. But it was absolutely fascinating. And it's really great because we're able to tie in these real life circumstances. It seems so dramatic and so bigger than life. These international and certainly historical events that you get a little peek behind the curtain in. But then there's also, what I learned there was, we talk about empathy an awful lot. And that whole relationship was built over months of empathetic, understanding. And to get an admission from somebody like Saddam Hussein, and it wasn't just, it wasn't a bright light in a dark room with, pointed fingers and a lot of yelling or any of the other, exaggerated methods of interrogation. It was really a relationship that admission was born on.
Yeah, that was George Piro did that presentation. He did a great job. And what's neat, so this year we've got Professor Christian Meisner and Dr. Susan Brandon. Susan was the research program manager for the high value detainee interrogation group and worked with Christian on all this research, and a lot of which we saw come to play in that presentation that George did. And it's all everything we talk about on the podcast. It's all about empathy and open-ended questions and effective interviewing, that when people are listening thinking, how do I get an employee to tell me the truth? How do I get my teenager to confess what they did over the weekend? We're using the same concepts in these kind of high stakes conversations: rapport, empathy, effective questioning, withholding the evidence, and treating people with respect gets you results. So that's been really, really neat. This year, so I mentioned Chris and Susan. We've also got the former chief of police in Aurora, Illinois, Kristen Zeman, who was another guest on one of our earlier podcasts, who's just a really powerful figure, and not just in law enforcement, but just in leadership. And she led that department through COVID, through civil unrest, post George Floyd. She led through a mass shooting in Aurora, Illinois. And so I'm really excited to hear her kind of speak about her experience as a leader in that situation.
You might have a podcast with her as well.
We did. Yeah, we did. She was great, and she's got her own now. She's been running around rocking it. So she's kicking off that conference on that Tuesday. So, hopefully people can join. We'll look forward to that event. And the last thing I want to mention about that week, we've got the WZ Masterclass on that Tuesday. And the reason I want to bring it up with you, you talked about recording interviews, about transparency, about being open to kind of the critique. That whole day, and I just kind of want to end with a little bit of this in your experience, but that whole day of the WZ Masterclass this year is going to be on how do you evaluate the interview afterwards, whether it's your self-evaluation or as a leader, but how do you look back at the interview and say, was it successful or not? And it's not being measured based off a confession, it's being measured based a lot of other things. And so I know in your leadership roles, you've really taken a passion to that, as making sure people are not just going to a training course and you're kind of blessing them to go out in the wild, but you've had a process to inspect and evaluate. So maybe you can speak to kind of the importance or what you did there.
Yeah, certainly. For me in the past, it started even with pre-employment, like creating an environment where people understood this was important to us. It's part of the interview process, and you're trying to get a job. A lot of people say that they've got the training, And many people have the certificate to prove it, but they don't have the experience or have had the time or opportunity to practically apply it. So we do make sure that they at least have foundational knowledge, and that'll also tell us that if you're hired, it's just a data point that if you're hired, that we need to put you through additional training, or you're ready to get started. But then it's a whole process to make sure, an evaluative process to make sure that you do know the process and you can apply it. And that comes through a little bit of peer mentorship. And then we have an ongoing review process where we listen to recorded interviews to make sure that you're on the process. And then if we need to retrain or upskill in different ways, that we know that we can do that. But it's an ongoing, continuing process. And any retailer that's got folks in the field conducting interviews on a regular basis, especially if you're in a recorded environment, I'd encourage you to create a program or a practice, to make sure that if you're following the WZ method, that you're following the 18 steps the right way, and have a way to record this information. Then also share with your interviewers that you are doing this, so they understand, that they have this opportunity to learn about their own practice, but B, that somebody is paying attention.
Yeah, and I'm going to expand that because I've seen on some cases I've worked the last few years in the law enforcement space of the same challenge, right? Is you go to it, and even if it's for yourself, you go to a training course and there's so much information you're absorbing. You go do the interview and you got this kind of highlight reel in your head of here's what I did, or here's what it sounded like I did, here's what I remember that I did. But having somebody else provide feedback is so important. And the other piece of that is you need to, like you said, have a protocol. You need to have a plan on what are you actually evaluating, because it's not just okay. They hit step one. Did they develop rapport? They asked about the weather. Check. Right. That's not what we're talking about. And
Right.
it's having a more, I think, transparent and strategic process on, if somebody was resistant during the interview and said I didn't do it or I don't want to talk about it. What did the interviewer do that moved them into a state where they actually provided information? That pivot point is where bad things can happen. That's where threats might happen or promises may happen, or maybe it was done the right way and rapport happened. But I think that's really key. And without getting into details, do you feel like some of the recordings that you or your team reviewed I'm just kind of setting you up for this, but um, did that change some people's interviewer behaviors after knowing that they're being recorded or after getting feedback from being recorded?
I don't think anybody told me that, but I can't imagine it didn't happen. I know earlier in my career when I was being recorded, it certainly made a difference for me.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I again, people are not going to do things out of line when they know it's being recorded. We would hope that we wouldn't have people who would do things out of line anyways, but it certainly keeps it from coming up.
Yeah. And it's, not that interviewers are hopefully not going to be doing things out of ill will anyway. But the other last benefit I'll just mention, because I know I've been on the soapbox for recording for a long time, as so has WZ as a group, but the amount of stress it takes off of the interviewer. Once you get past all right, how stupid do I look on camera? Once you get past that, but the amount of stress of, did I take all the right notes? Do I remember every detail that person said? Now I can go back and listen to it. And the cognitive load that I have as the interviewer is drastically reduced. So I can actually focus on, well, what did the person actually say? Like, let me hear the details right now, and I can actively listen versus my head is down in a notepad as you're giving me some key details. So I think that's really impactful.
You also, when you get comfortable with it and you're comfortable with your own skills, you actually start to begin to want the feedback. Like you want to be better.
Right.
Um, we did have investigators, ask us regularly, "Hey, did you listen to my interview? Can you listen to my interview? Will you listen to my interview?" Because they want that feedback. Because they get really comfortable with their skills and they want to be better.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a really good point. I think even as like those of you out there that are public speaking, and I've done this, and again, it's miserable, but it's great if you can have somebody record you while you're giving, even if it's a 5 minute presentation in front of your team, whatever it is. But I'll end with this, and I'm going to ask you one last question. But I terrified of public speaking. When I first started in that kind of field where it was required, and I remember I went to a high potential or development day or whatever it was. So I had to go up in front of peers and supervisors and give a presentation, and they recorded us. and they recorded us, and they gave all of our peers a score sheet to write down, what was their body language like? What was their command presence like? Did they communicate concisely and all this kind of stuff? So my anxiety was through
It's
the roof.
nerve-wracking.
I did terrible. I mean, it was awful. Like I didn't know what to do with my damn hands because they're all over the place. So I swayed back and forth, monotone, didn't smile, terrible. But I got all this feedback from peers, and I still have the little. It was on like a little micro CD. I still have it, and I still watch it once in a while just to remind myself. But those kind of things just make you so much better when you can watch yourself from a different perspective. So anyway, just share that with the group. Even if you're doing an interview for the first time, record yourself in the mirror doing it to see what it's going to sound like in front of another person. Last question I want to ask you that we kind of end every episode with is just if you got one final takeaway. We call it our one last truth, but if people zoned out during my last story, listen now. Wise words of Mr. David Lund. But one last thing you want people to walk away with that might help in their career or just communication overall.
So I don't think it's a secret, but I would say it's a truth. And again, not newsflash, but your success or failure with just about anything you do is going to be determined by the effort and energy that you give it. I love to say I'm a student of the game. Whatever that game might be, it could be something as specific as investigative interviewing. It could be leadership practices and principles. It could be pickleball strategies. I don't know, anything. But being a student requires you to realize that you don't know everything. And you might know things that aren't relevant anymore also. So being a continuous learner and being, curious and inquisitive will make you better, but always give it energy.
Sounds like we should have a pickleball tournament at next year's Elite Training Day, is what I just.
I'll have to read up on strategies for pickleball because I don't have any.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great takeaway. I was just at a conference and a professor said to the whole group, he said, do you think that whatever we're doing now, whatever the topic was, but whatever the process we're thinking about right now, do you think you're going to do that same thing in 20 years or will there be a better way? And everybody said, well, of course there'll be a better way in 20 years. And he said, well, then why in the hell are we still doing something we were doing 20 years ago? Why are we not revisiting it now? And it's just kind of an interesting way to look at that. But you're right, that continued education is great. Put that effort into it. So that's perfect. I look forward to obviously working with you in your new capacity. I'm super excited about where II is going, about the new CFI exam coming out soon, and hopefully a lot of you listening will see you in a couple of months. But if not, stay tuned on LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook and all the different ways that WZ, II, and Truth Be Told is out there. And make sure to like and subscribe to the podcast. But thank you so much, Mr. Lund, for joining me today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you all. Thanks for listening to this episode of Truth Be Told. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And to keep this conversation going, follow the Truth Be Told podcast on LinkedIn and Truth Be Told CFI on Twitter. On behalf of the International Association of Interviewers, Rick Landers-Zalowski, and our valued sponsors, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast.